Angrboda. The name arrives slowly, in syllables. She who brings grief, and before anything else is known about her, before any story has been told, there is only that name and the place where she stood. Jotunheimra, Afgaftiwiking Toim, a realm the Norse tradition describes, not as a land exactly, but as a direction, the cold direction, the old direction, the one that lies beyond any map the gods had made. The ground beneath her feet was frost-dark stone, and the marshes lay wide and unnamed around her, and nothing that grew there had been grown by any hand that was not older than the world the gods had ordered for themselves. This is where the story begins, not in a hall with fire and mead and the bright clatter of divine company, but out in the distances, where the cold has been cold since before there was a word for cold, and where a giantess whose name meant sorrow stood in the low light of a world that was still mostly wild. The Norse tradition, as it has come down through the centuries, is preserved in two principal sources, both of them Icelandic, both of them medieval, both of them at some distance from the earliest oral forms of what they record. The Prose Edda was compiled by the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson around 1220 CE, a learned man, a chieftain, a writer who assembled the old stories with the particular care of someone who understood they were already fading, already needing to be caught and written down before the generations that remembered them in their full living form were gone. Among the sections of the Prose Edda, the one called Gylfaginning, the beguiling of Gylfi, contains much of what is known about the ordering of the Norse cosmos, the nature of the gods, and the beings whose existence complicated that order in interesting and irreversible ways. It is in the Gylfaginning that the name Angrboda appears, and with it the account of the children she bore in Jotunheimra to a father who was himself no straightforward figure among the gods. Loki is identified in the Norse sources as the father of these children, and the tradition never quite resolves what to make of him. He is counted among the Aesir, the primary family of Norse gods, whose realm is Asgarth, the high citadel at the center of the ordered world. And yet he is not of the Aesir by birth. He is of the Jotnar, the giants, the same ancient race as Angrboda herself. He came into Asgarth and was given a place there, was given something like kinship with Odin, and moved through the halls of the gods with a freedom that no one quite authorized, but no one quite withdrew. What he did in the cold distances of Jotunheimra with a giantess whose name announced grief before any child was born, this the Prose Edda records without particular alarm. There were children, 3 of them, each one something the world had not contained before. The first of the 3 was Fenrir. In the Gylfaginning, he is identified as Fenrisulfur, the Fenris wolf, and the name connects to the Old Norse word for fen, for marsh, for the wet and low and borderless terrain of Jotunheimra, where his mother stood in the cold before he existed. He was a wolf, not a wolf in the way that ordinary wolves ran in the forests at the edges of the human world, thin and gray and afraid of fire. He was something whose nature the tradition describes with quiet plainness, enormous, growing larger, the kind of creature whose existence in the ordered world represented a particular kind of challenge to the gods who had worked very hard to establish that order. The second child was Jormungandr, the great serpent, called also the Midgard serpent, a creature of such immensity that the gods placed it in the ocean surrounding the world of humans, where it grew until its body encircled Midgard entire, and its own tail rested in its mouth. The third child was Hel, a figure given governance over Niflheim, the cold and misty realm beneath the roots of the world, where the dead who did not fall in battle made their way, a realm of quiet and permanence and names no longer called. 3 children, 3 different shapes of power, Three different edges of the Norse cosmos, each one assigned a different kind of containment. The tradition holds all three of them in the same frame, the children of Loki and Angrboda, regarded by the gods of Asgard as profoundly dangerous. And yet the word dangerous sits strangely here, because the Norse cosmos was never a world in which danger could be entirely removed. It was a world in which enormous forces existed at every boundary, in which the gods had made their ordered realm, not by eliminating the wild things, but by placing them in particular locations and arranging the rest of existence around the fact of them. Jormungandr in the ocean, Hel in her realm of the quiet dead, and Fenrir. This was the question that required a different answer. The tradition does not explain exactly when the decision was made, or whose voice was first raised in the assembly of the Aesir to propose what was proposed. What the Gylfaginning records is the outcome. The gods decided to bring the young wolf to Asgard, not to leave him in Jotunheim to grow to adulthood under no watch but the cold sky and the wide marsh and whatever his mother might have taught him, not to send him to some other edge of the cosmos, as his siblings had been sent, but to bring him inside their own realm, to keep him where they could see him, to raise him under the direct observation of the gods themselves. There is something in this decision that the tradition simply presents as fact, without explaining the reasoning behind it in full. Perhaps the gods believed that proximity was its own kind of influence, that a creature raised in Asgard would be shaped by Asgard, would come to understand itself as something of Asgard, would grow into a different kind of being than it might become in the wild distances of Jotunheimer. Perhaps the decision had nothing to do with influence and everything to do with surveillance. Perhaps both of these were the same thing to the gods who made it. The image the tradition preserves is a young wolf in Asgard, the only creature of Jotunheimer among the bright halls of the gods. What Asgard looked like to Fenrir, the tradition does not say. The prose Edda describes Asgard as a realm of halls and towers and bridges and the deep roots of a social order that the gods had maintained across long ages, a place defined by the company of those who belonged to it and by the complex interplay of obligation and power that governed their relationships with one another. Into this world came a wolf, whose mother's name meant grief, and whose father moved between all worlds without quite belonging to any of them. He was young, he was growing, and the gods who had brought him there were already watching him from what the Gylfaginning describes as a careful distance. The distance is perhaps the most telling detail. Not cruelty, not neglect, not the explicit withdrawal of welcome, but the careful spacing of beings who were fully aware of what they were living alongside, who had made a choice to bring him there, and were now living with the texture of that choice, which was a wolf in their halls, growing larger by increments, watched by everyone, and approached by almost no one. The tradition makes no complaint about this arrangement on Fenrir's behalf. It simply records it, and in recording it, it preserves something that is one of the quieter and more interesting aspects of the Norse mythological world. The gods were not separate from the forces that threatened them. They shared a world with those forces. In some cases, they invited them in. What grew in the space between Fenrir and the gods of Asgard? The space that was measured in feet, and managed in looks, and defined by who moved and who held still, was a particular kind of knowledge. Everyone in those halls knew what Fenrir was. Everyone knew what had been said about him by those whose business was the saying of such things. The tradition holds this knowledge as a given. The prophecies were known, the fate was spoken, and still the gods had brought him there, and still they watched him grow, and still the distance between them and the young wolf widened a little more each time they gathered in the same space as him. This is the ordinary texture of the world the Norse myths describe, not ignorance, not denial, not the dramatic confrontation of beings who refuse to accept what the cosmos has already decided. Something quieter, and in many ways stranger, the full possession of terrible knowledge, and the very slow unfolding of a response to it, and in the meantime, a young wolf in the halls of the gods, in a realm that was not his own, watched but not avoided, fed but not befriended. Almost no one fed him. That is the other detail the tradition preserves, the other figure in the picture of those early days in Asgarth. Among all the gods of the assembled Aesir, Odin, who had made the world from the body of the giant Ymir and hung himself from the great ash tree Yggdrasil to learn the runes, Thor, the thunder god, whose hammer maintained the boundaries of the ordered world against the constant pressure of giants and chaos from beyond, Frigg, who sat in her hall Fensalir and knew the fates of all beings without speaking of them, Freyr and Fragja and Heimdall and Baldur and the whole company of beings who made Asgarth what it was. Among all of them, only one walked forward with food and stood close enough to the wolf to place it in reach of those growing jaws. His name was Tyr. The Prose Edda identifies Tyr as the boldest among the Aesir, bolder than Thor in a particular way, the way that has nothing to do with physical force and everything to do with the willingness to stand in a difficult place without flinching, to approach what others step back from, to make a bodily choice in full knowledge of what that choice costs. He was associated in the Norse tradition with law and justice and the sanctioning of martial conflict, the god who presided over those human activities that required both force and a framework, both power and an agreement about how power should be exercised. That this figure, of all the gods in Asgarth, was the one who brought the young wolf his food. This is one of those details the tradition offers without commentary, letting the image stand as its own kind of meaning. Picture the scene as the Gylfaginning allows it to be pictured. The hall behind Tyr holds still. The assembled gods stand where they stand, at whatever distance they have settled into, as Fenrir has grown larger, and the space around him has correspondingly widened. No one moves, no one speaks toward the wolf, or toward Tyr, or about what Tyr is doing, and Tyr walks forward, one step and then another. Whatever he carries in his hands, the tradition does not specify the food, does not describe the approach in any more detail than this. He carries it forward and places it where the wolf can reach it, and this is the single point of movement in the scene, the one figure in the whole still picture of a hall of gods, and a growing wolf who is actually closing the distance rather than maintaining it. What Tyr knew when he walked forward, the tradition does not record. He would have known what all the gods knew, that the children of Loki and Angrboda had been regarded as dangerous from before they were born, that the prophecies concerning Fenrir were already settled in the fabric of the Norse cosmos, that the wolf growing in the halls of Asgarth was not simply a large and inconvenient creature, but something whose future had already been spoken by voices that did not speak uncertainly. He knew this. He walked forward anyway. And this small repeated act, the daily or weekly or however regular act of bringing food to the only creature in Asgarth who had no other source of it, this is the first relationship the tradition shows between a god and the great wolf. Not fear, not confrontation, not the elaborate strategy of containment that would come later, just Tyr walking forward in a hall that holds still around him. The tradition, as Snorri Sturluson recorded it in the 13th century, was already old when his pen touched the page. The Gylfaginning draws on material that predates the Prose Edda by several hundred years. Oral traditions, skaldic poetry, the mythological frameworks of a Norse world that had been thinking about Fenrir and his siblings, and the nature of fate, and the relationship between the gods and the wild forces at the edges of their ordered realm, for much longer than any written record can reach. Snorri himself was a Christian, writing in a Christian Iceland, working with materials from a pre-Christian tradition that he understood to have tremendous literary and cultural value, even as he no longer participated in the religious framework it encoded. His account preserves details that suggest access to very old sources, and it preserves them with a care that lets the modern reader or the modern listener, in the dark, in the late hours, follow the story into a world that has been there for a very long time and does not require permission to enter. There is a second collection that stands alongside the Prose Edda as the primary source for Norse mythology, and it is perhaps even older in the material it preserves. The Poetic Edda is a gathering of Old Norse poems, mythological and heroic, transmitted through oral tradition before being written down in a manuscript called the Codex Regius, dated to approximately 1270 CE, half a century after Snorri compiled the Prose Edda. Both sources name Fenrir. Both use the word Fenrisulfalfal. Both hold the wolf in the same frame as a being whose origins are in Jotunheimr, whose nature was regarded by the gods with serious and calibrated attention, and whose place in the story of the Norse cosmos was already fixed before the gods had made any decision about what to do with him. Together, these two collections constitute most of what survives of Norse myth in written form, and together they describe a world that is vast and cold and very old, in which the gods are powerful but not omnipotent, in which fate is real and binding, and in which the children of a giantess named for Grief were each assigned to a different edge of the cosmos to wait in their particular kind of containment. The name Angrboda, she who brings grief, is worth sitting with for a moment longer before following the story forward. It is a name that announces its own meaning before any action is taken. In the Norse tradition, names are not incidental. They carry weight. They describe nature. They are, at their most serious, a kind of fate compressed into sound, the thing a being is, stated plainly, so that anyone who hears the name already knows something essential about what stands before them. Angrboda's name told the gods everything they needed to know about the children she would bear. It told them in the same language in which the Norns carved fate beneath the roots of the world, the language of plain, irrevocable statement, she who brings grief. And the grief she brought was not immediately visible in a young wolf in the halls of Asgard. It was the kind of grief that was already established in the structure of the cosmos, waiting patiently in the cold distances of a world that the gods had ordered, but had not entirely made their own. Jotunheim, where Angrboda stood, and where the three children came into being. This is a place the Norse tradition describes in terms that make it feel less like a specific location and more like a quality of the world. It is the cold, the old, the wild, the direction that lies beyond the boundaries of what the gods have managed to settle and name. The giants who inhabit it, the Jotnar, are not simply enemies of the gods in the Norse accounts, though they are often that. They are also older, in some accounts predating the gods themselves, inhabiting a world that existed before the ordered cosmos was assembled from the body of Ymir. Angrboda belongs to this older stratum. Her dwelling is somewhere in that vast, frost-dark wilderness where the ground has not been named, and the cold is the original cold, the cold that existed before the gods made fire a meaningful force in the world. To stand in Jotunheim, in the early Norse mythological imagination, is to stand before the world was fully assembled in the primordial condition of things that the gods had pushed back but never entirely eliminated. This is where Fenrir comes from, not from the bright halls of Asgard, not from the cultivated social world of the Aesir with its obligations and its hierarchies and its long history of alliances and conflicts and the kind of meaning that accumulates when beings live together over very long spans of time. He comes from Jotunheimr, from the cold and the unnamed, from a mother whose name was Grief, and a father who moved between all worlds without belonging to any of them. The tradition does not present this as tragedy. It presents it as origin, the specific set of conditions that made Fenrir what he was, as opposed to what he might have been if anything about those conditions had been different. He was the thing that grew from those conditions, the way a particular kind of weather grows from the intersection of particular pressures. Cold air from one direction, the particular restlessness of a father who was never entirely of the realm he inhabited. A name that meant grief, given by a language that believed names meant exactly what they said. And from all of this, a wolf. The gods in Asgard who received the young wolf into their halls and watched him grow were themselves beings of long experience with the world, the Norse tradition describes. Odin had sacrificed his eye at the well of Mimir for a drink of wisdom so profound that it had reorganized his understanding of the cosmos. He had hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 nights, wounded by his own spear, to learn the runes that were the deepest structure of reality. He had traveled to the edges of the world and returned knowing things that the other gods did not know, and some of what he knew he carried very quietly, in the way that certain kinds of knowledge can only be carried quietly, because their weight cannot be set down. He knew about Fenrir. He knew more than the wolf's parentage and the wolf's name. The tradition does not need to state explicitly that he knew what the prophecies said about the wolf who now ate from Tyr's hand in the halls of Asgarth. The architecture of the Norse mythological world makes this knowledge not only possible, but inevitable for a figure of Odin's reach. He knew, and still the wolf was there, and still Tyr walked forward. What is being described here, in this quiet scene of a hall in Asgarth, with a growing wolf at its center, and a god who alone will approach him, is a relationship between the Norse gods and fate that the tradition holds as one of its central and most interesting features. The gods did not simply receive their fates and lie down in them. They acted, they made decisions. They moved forward with the full weight of foreknowledge pressing against them, and found ways to inhabit the world their knowledge described, which was a world they could not unmake, but in which they continued to exist and continued to make choices. The decision to bring Fenrir to Asgarth was a choice made in full knowledge of what Fenrir was. The choice Tyr made, each time he walked forward while the hall behind him held still, was a choice made in the same knowledge. These are not the choices of beings who have accepted passivity. They are the choices of beings who have accepted reality and continue to act within it with as much care and intention as they can bring to bear. The poetic Edda, in the poems that describe the Norse cosmos at its most expansive, returns often to the image of Yggdrasil, the great ash tree, whose roots reach into 3 wells, whose branches shelter the eagle at the top, and the serpent at the bottom, and the squirrel Ratatoskra, who runs between them, carrying messages that inflame the rivalry between eagle and serpent, whose leaves shelter the 4 deer, whose constant grazing keeps the tree perpetually under pressure, whose vast structure connects all 9 worlds of the Norse cosmos into a single integrated form. The 9 worlds are arrayed across Yggdrasil's vast structure, Asgarth above, Midgard at the center, Jotunheimr to the cold edge, Niflheim below, Svartalfheimr in the earth, and the other realms in their assigned positions, and each of the children of Loki and Angerbotha inhabits one of these positions. Jormungandr encircles Midgard in the ocean. Hel governs Niflheim from her hall, called Eljuthnir, and Fenrir was in Asgarth, which was not a position the tradition had made for him, which was not an edge of the cosmos, or a depth beneath it, but the center, the hall of the gods themselves, the most ordered and intentional place in the Norse world. That placement, a child of Angrboda and Loki at the center of the god's own realm, growing larger each day, while the distance between him and the other gods slowly widened, is one of those details the Norse tradition carries without apparent effort, as though there were nothing remarkable about the arrangement. Perhaps there wasn't, within the logic of the world the tradition describes. The Norse cosmos was never neatly divided between the ordered and the wild, the divine and the monstrous, the inside and the outside. Its borders were porous. Its categories overlapped. The gods went to Jotunheimer and brought back wives and wisdom and occasionally trouble. The giants occasionally entered Asgard and occasionally married into it. Loki himself was the walking demonstration of how completely the boundary between these two categories could be inhabited, how much space existed in the seam between them. And Fenrir was in Asgarth, growing, watched, fed by Tyr's steady hands while the rest of the hall kept its careful distance. Snorri Sturluson, in his stone-walled room in 13th century Iceland, setting these names down in ink: Angrboda, Fenrisulfur, Jotunheimer, Tyr, was working with a story that had already traveled a very long way through time before it arrived at his pen. The Norse tradition, in its pre-Christian form, had no written literature. It was carried in the mouths of skalds, in the formulaic language of oral poetry, in the religious contexts of a world that the arrival of Christianity had already substantially transformed by the time Snorri was writing. What he preserved was not the living tradition, but a record of it, careful, learned, sometimes interpretive, written by a man who was both deeply inside the literary tradition of Norse poetry and outside the religious framework it originally served. The Gylfaginning is a dialogue in which a human king named Gylfi visits Asgard in disguise and asks questions of three mysterious figures, and the mythology of the Norse world is delivered through their answers. It is a frame that lets Snorri put the old stories into a written form that his audience could access, and it preserves within that frame details that bear the marks of very old oral material, the specificity of names like Lading and Dromi, the detail of Tyr's approach, the quiet plainness with which the tradition describes the gods watching a wolf in their halls grow larger than they had perhaps expected when they chose to bring him there. The story of Fenrir is one of the most completely preserved stories in the Norse mythological corpus. It has a beginning, the cold distances of Jotunheimer and the children of a giantess named Grief. It has a middle, which is Asgarth and the growing wolf, and the careful distance and Tyr walking forward where others did not. And it has an ending, or at least an ending of this particular phase of it, which the tradition recounts in specific and detailed terms that preserve the names of every object and location involved in what eventually happened on a dark lake's small island. The story is complete in itself, and it is also part of a larger story about the Norse cosmos and what the tradition understood about the relationship between fate and action, between the gods who ordered the world and the forces they could contain but never entirely eliminate. But that is further into the story than where the scene sits now. Here, in the beginning, in the first light of this very old account, there is only Angrboda standing in the cold of Jotunheimer, in a landscape without paths, and the children she bore, who were each placed at a different edge of the cosmos, and the decision that brought one of them to Asgarth instead of an edge, to the center instead of the margin, to a hall full of gods who watched him from a careful distance while he ate from the single pair of hands that moved toward him without hesitating. The wolf is young, the hall is still, and somewhere in the careful quiet of that scene, Tyr is already walking forward, the food in his hands, his feet moving across the floor of the god's own hall toward the only creature there, who came from somewhere else entirely, who carries in his bones the cold of Jotunheimer, and the name of a mother whose name meant grief, who grows a little larger each time the gods see him, and who waits with the patient, uncomplicated presence of a thing that does not yet know what it is going to become. At the roots of the world, in a place below all places, there is the sound of water very close. Not moving water, not a river or a current, or anything that runs toward somewhere. Still water, dark water, water that has been there since before the gods made the sky above it, or set the stars into their positions, or gave the sun a name and told it where to go each morning. The well of earth sits beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, the great ash tree, and the roots of Yggdrasil are older than the halls of Asgarth, and older than the walls of Midgard, and older, in the counting of the Norse tradition, than nearly anything that can be named. The roots go down further than can be followed. The water at their base does not move. 3 figures sit beside that water in the particular dark of the world beneath the world. Their names, as the tradition holds them, are Earth and Vertundi and Skuld, and they are the Norns, the 3 weavers of fate in the Norse cosmological order, the beings who determine what will happen to gods and to men and to everything that exists between the roots of the world tree and the furthest boundary of the 9 realms it supports. They are not gods. They are not giants, exactly, though the tradition sometimes places them at the border of that category. What they are, in the oldest understanding of the Norse sources, is something older than either the principle of necessity itself, shaped into 3 presences at the still water under the roots of everything. Urther means what has become, Verdandi means what is becoming, Skuld means what must be, and what the 3 of them have carved together, working quietly at the edge of the well, cannot be uncarved. The Voluspa, the first of the great poems of the Poetic Edda, opens with a seeress, a vulva called out of death and asked by Odin to speak what she knows of the world, from its beginning to its end. She was there, she says, when the earth was not yet raised from the sea. She remembers the 9 worlds and the world trees still in seed, and she names the Norns in the Voluspa as the beings who established the first laws, the ones who set in place the structure of fate, that everything that followed would have to live inside. They came, the seeress says, from the world of the giants. They came to the well of Urther. They made their home there, and they began their work, and the work has not stopped since. 3 women carving at the roots of everything, in a place where the water does not move. The word the tradition uses for what the Norns weave and carve is Urlog, sometimes translated as fate, but carrying a sense closer to primal law, or layers already laid down, or the structure of what has already been decided, which every new thing that enters the world will have to inhabit, whether it wishes to or not. Urlog is related in spirit to the Old English word weird, from which the modern word weird descends, and weird shares with Urlog the quality of referring not simply to a destiny that awaits, but to a pattern that has been set into the foundation of reality itself, before any particular life or god or creature arrive to participate in it. Both words carry the sense of something woven into the weave of things rather than imposed upon them from outside. Erlög is not what the gods decide. It is what was there before the gods had voices, carved at the roots of the world tree by three figures working in the dark and the stillness, and it binds the gods as surely as it binds anything else. The Prose Edda, compiled by the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson somewhere around the year 1220, describes the Norns as spinning and weaving, as well as carving, the threads of fate stretched out and pulled tight and cut, each one corresponding to the life of a being in the world above. Some Norns, Snorri's account notes, are gentle, and the lives they shape are long and full. Others are not. The Norns who weave hardship are not cruel. Exactly, in the tradition's understanding, they are simply doing what the role requires, following the structure of what Erlög has laid down, adding each day's layer of fate to the layers that were already there when this particular life, or god or creature, first arrived. When the thread ends, it ends. Not because the Norns bear the one whose thread it is any particular feeling, but because the length of the thread was the length it was, and the weaving follows its own logic, which was not made for the comfort of the ones whose lives it governs. In the Norse tradition, this is simply how things are. It is not presented as unjust. It is presented as the structure. High up above the roots, in the halls of Asgarth, Odin sits with a great deal already settled inside him. The two ravens who rest on his shoulders each morning and return to him each evening are called Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, in translation, though those words flatten slightly in the crossing, carry less than the Old Norse originals, which suggests something closer to the process of thinking and the act of remembering as living, moving forces rather than states. Each day, at the gray beginning of light, the two ravens lift from Odin's shoulders and disperse across the 9 worlds. Hugin in one direction, Munin in another, two dark shapes dwindling rapidly against the sky until they are too small to follow. They cross Midgard and Jotunheimer and the cold reaches of Niflheim. They move over seas that have no names in any human language. They watch and they remember, and at dusk they return, landing again on Odin's shoulders with their beaks close to his ears, and what they whisper there is everything that has happened in every corner of the world since dawn. What Hugin brings back is what was thought. What Munin brings back is what was done, and where, and by whom, and in what light. The tradition describes Odin as also practicing Scyther, a form of Norse magic associated specifically with the working and manipulation of fate, a practice he learned from Freyja of the Vanir, the older divine family who preceded or coexisted with the Aesir in the complex genealogy the Norse sources preserve. Scyther allowed its practitioner to perceive what was already woven into the structure of fate, to read the threads of Erlög as they ran forward into what had not yet happened but was already decided. It also, in some accounts, allowed a practiced scyther worker to alter the weave slightly, to nudge the threads, to loosen what was tight and tighten what was loose. Though the tradition is careful about this claim, and what Odin gains most consistently from his practice is not the ability to change fate, but the ability to see it clearly and in full before it arrives. He gave an eye to the well of Mimir to drink the water of wisdom and see further than sight permits. He hung 9 days and 9 nights on Yggdrasil itself, suspended by his own doing in a trial that the tradition frames as self-offering, and came down from the tree with the runes and their meanings in his hands. What Odin accumulates across all of these acts is not power over fate. It is knowledge of what fate has already decided, down to the detail and the particular. And so what Odin knows about Fenrir, the wolf growing somewhere in Asgard there below him, is not a vague unease, it is not a suspicion or a worry. It is the specific, precise, already settled knowledge of exactly what the wolf's presence in the world means for him. The Voluspa states it plainly. Among the visions the seeress describes in that poem, the world destroyed, the sky falling, the sea rising, the stars going out, she names Fenrir explicitly as the wolf who will swallow Odin at Ragnarok, not wound him, not drive him from the field, swallow him, the All-Father taken whole into the body of the wolf at the final battle, the end of Odin as a presence in the world, accomplished not by a weapon or a rival god, but by the great wolf, whose chain the gods had worked so carefully to forge. This is not presented in the Volapa as a possibility, or a risk, or an outcome that might be avoided if the right measures were taken in time. The seeress is describing what she has seen, and what she has seen is what has already been decided in the layers of Urlurg, beneath the world, and what has been decided there does not wait for anyone's permission. Ragnarok is the structure at the far end of the world's thread. The wolf swallowing Odin is one moment in that structure. The Norns at the Well of Urther have been doing their work for a very long time. There is a particular quality of knowledge that belongs to someone who knows how a story ends and must live inside it anyway, watching it move in the direction it was always moving. The Norse sources do not dwell on what this costs Odin. They do not describe his private relationship to the prophecy, do not give him the kind of interiority that later literary traditions might reach for. But the structure of the myth is very clear. The ravens come home each evening. The scyther shows what the weave holds. The Voluspa was not a new document, and Odin knows. He knows the wolf growing in his halls is the wolf that will kill him. He feeds it. He watches it grow. He permits it to remain, choosing proximity to the thing that will end him over the alternative of allowing it to grow to adulthood somewhere beyond his observation. This is not a comfortable position. It is, in the Norse understanding of divine behavior, the position that Urlug requires, the response of a god who has read the threads clearly enough to know that what has been woven cannot be unraveled, and who acts accordingly with full knowledge of what the acting is worth. The Poetic Edda survives primarily in a single manuscript, the Codex Regius, a vellum document dated to approximately 1270 CE, written in a medieval Icelandic hand in faded ink, and the Voluspa is its first poem. The physical manuscript is housed now in the Arni Magnusson Institute in Reykjavik, and the pages on which the prophecy of Fenrir appears are worn at the edges from the particular kind of wear that comes from centuries of being handled. The words the seeress speaks were composed far earlier than the manuscript that preserves them. The Voluspa is generally placed by scholars in the Viking Age, perhaps in the 10th century, which means the prophecy of Odin's death at the wolf's jaws was already several hundred years old before Snorri compiled the Prose Edda and set down his prose account of the same tradition. The prophecy did not originate in one mind or one document. It was part of the cosmological understanding that the Norse tradition carried across generations, embedded in the larger structure of how the world was understood to be made and how it was going to end. Snorri wrote it down, the Codex Regius preserved it, but neither of them invented it. They received it from something older and set it carefully into a form that would outlast them both. In the halls of Asgard, meanwhile, the wolf grows. Fenrir is the son of Loki and the giantess Angrboda, whose name means she who brings grief, and he carries within him the mingled inheritance of Loki's particular kind of changefulness and Angrboda's cold belonging to Jotunheim, the realm of the giants that predates the ordered world the gods made from the body of the first giant. He was brought to Asgardr as a young wolf, still small enough to be managed, and the gods made the decision to keep him among them rather than leave him to grow unsupervised beyond their reach. It was the kind of decision that seems in the telling like it should have a clean logic behind it. Keep what you fear close, where at least it can be watched, but the logic is imperfect, because the watching cannot change what the watching reveals, which is that Fenrir is growing, and the rate at which he is growing is not the rate at which a creature that can be managed continues to grow. The Gelfagening, the section of Snorri's Prose Edda that narrates the bulk of the Fenrir story, does not describe the wolf's growth in linear terms. There is no record of his size at each year, no catalogue of dimensions. What it conveys instead is a gathering discomfort among the gods, a quality of attention that changes as the months pass. At first, only Tyr was bold enough to approach and feed him, but as the wolf grew, as the meals required to maintain him grew with him, and as the physical fact of his presence in Asgard became harder to hold at the distance of an abstract concern, the rest of the gods moved back, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone declared or formalized, simply a tendency, repeated often enough to become a pattern, to find reasons to be elsewhere when the wolf needed feeding, to allow more space between themselves and the part of the halls where Fenrir moved and ate and slept. The distance grew as the wolf grew. Both of these were facts that everyone in Asgard could see, and neither of them was spoken aloud, and both of them continued. This is one of the more quietly interesting features of the myth as the Norse sources preserve it, that the gods of Asgard, who possessed the ravens and the scyther and the knowledge of what Urleg had laid down at the foundation of things, did not treat this knowledge as conclusive, or rather, they treated it as conclusive in their bones and in the widening space they kept between themselves and the wolf, while continuing to act as though a solution that would forestall the conclusion might yet be found. They knew, and knowing they watched, and waited, and moved a little further back, and kept watching. There is something in this that the tradition does not comment on directly, but that the structure of the story makes visible, the gap between what is known in the full cosmological sense and what can be acted upon in the present moment, which is always narrower than the knowledge would suggest. Odin can see the thread running forward into Ragnarok. The Norns have carved what they have carved. The structure of fate does not prevent the gods from trying, because the trying is also, presumably, part of the structure. The wolf grows. The gods watch. The trying comes later, in iron and in something stranger than iron. But before any of that, there is this period, the one the myth passes through somewhat quickly and does not name, in which the knowledge of what is coming sits among the gods like a fact that has been accepted and not yet addressed, and everyone is aware of it, and the wolf is growing, and no one says anything. The Norns at the Well of Urther are not troubled by any of this. They are far below the concerns of Asgard, in a place where the political arrangements of the gods have no particular weight. Urther and Verdandi and Skuld sit at the still water, and the roots of Yggdrasil are above them, and the sounds that come down from the world above, if any sounds reach them at all, are very faint and very far. The carving proceeds, the weaving proceeds. What has been laid down in the layers of Erlog does not require maintenance or supervision. It holds because that is what primal law does. It holds quietly beneath everything that is built on top of it, and the things built on top of it do not change what is underneath, however heavy they become. A hall full of gods watching a wolf with increasing unease does not affect the structure beneath the hall. The structure beneath the hall was there long before the hall, and the structure is what it is. There is a useful contrast between what Urlug is and what the gods can do with their knowledge of it. Urlug cannot be altered. The Norns do not take requests. The fate that has been laid down in the structure of the world from its beginning is not open to revision by the gods of Asgard, however powerful they are, however much they know, however precisely calibrated their anxiety. What the gods can do, what the story demonstrates them doing, in the long period between Fenrir's arrival in Asgard and the eventual binding, is act within the structure of what is fated, rather than against it, delay rather than prevent, contain rather than unmake. This is the specific shape that divine action takes in the Norse tradition, under the conditions of Urlog, not defiance, not helplessness, something in between, conducted with clear eyes by beings who know the thread's length and act nonetheless, because the interval between now and the thread's end is real even when its termination is not in question. Hugin and Munin, somewhere far above the roots of Yggdrasil, move across the sky of the nine worlds. They are small, against the scale of the sky the tradition describes, the sky that is the skull of Ymir, the first giant, held up by 4 dwarves at its corners. 2 ravens are very small. They move in their separate directions, and the distance between them grows during the day, and at dusk they return, and the distance closes, and they land again on the shoulders of the god who sent them out and has been waiting for what they bring back. What they bring is everything, filtered through thought and through memory, compressed into the soft pressure of a beak close to an ear. And what Odin does with what they bring is what he has always done. He holds it, adds it to what he already holds, and continues to be the god who knows more than anyone else and must act within the limits of what even complete knowledge permits, which are narrower than one might expect. The well of earth has no current. Its surface is still. When a leaf falls into it from the roots of Yggdrasil far above, the ripple spreads outward in a perfect circle, and then the water is still again, and the leaf is there on the surface in the new stillness, as though it had always been there. Urther and Verthandi and Skuld do not look up when the leaf falls. They continue their work. What the leaf is, where it fell from, which branch of the world tree released it, and in what season, none of this changes the nature of the work or the pace at which it proceeds. The carving continues. The weaving continues. The water is still, and somewhere in the layers of Urlog that have been accumulating since before the world had a sky above it, the fate of the wolf and the fate of the Allfather lie together in the deep structure of things, already bound, already complete, waiting only for time to carry the world to the place where what has been decided will be seen to have been decided. Odin knows this. He has known it for a long time. He sits with the weight of it, settled somewhere very central, not urgent, not raw, the way something that has been known for a very long time can settle into a kind of heaviness that is different from grief, that is not exactly acceptance either, that is simply the condition of being a god who reads the threads with complete clarity and has made his home in what they show. The ravens return, the wolf grows larger. Somewhere below, the Norns work quietly at the still water. The great ash tree stands above it all, its roots in 3 wells, its branches reaching the sky, its leaves going through their long, slow seasons in a world that is already inside the structure of what has been determined. In Asgard, the space around Fenrir has grown a little wider again, not by declaration, not by any meeting of the gods or any formal decision to maintain a greater distance, just by the accumulation of small choices, each one individually explicable, each one individually reasonable. There was somewhere else to be. There was something else that needed attending to, and collectively adding up to a pattern that anyone watching from a sufficient distance could see very clearly. The gods know what the wolf is. The gods know what the wolf will become. The gods know, with the full precision that Odin's practice of Scyther and the raven's daily returns have given them, what the wolf's being in the world means for the being of the world, and knowing this, they have placed the wolf in the center of their hall and continue to live around him, and the radius of the space they leave around him has expanded slightly, and every day that passes Fenrir is the size he is today, which is larger than he was yesterday and smaller than he will be tomorrow. That is the only arithmetic that matters, and everyone in Asgardr already knows it, and the knowing sits quietly among them like the still water at the roots of the world, and nothing is said, and the wolf is growing, and the light changes in the hall as the day moves from one end to the other, and at dusk Hugin and Munin come home with everything they saw. The Norns are still working at the Well of Earth. They have always been working at the Well of Earth. In the morning, they will still be working there. The water around them does not move. Somewhere in the middle distance of Asgard, Fenrir lifts his head, and the gods who are gathered at the edges of the hall note the distance between themselves and the wolf, and find it sufficient, for now the hall holds still around that assessment, and in the deep structure of Erdlug, laid down before any of them arrived, and unchanged by anything any of them have done, the thread continues its patient run toward the end that has been its end since before Yggdrasil had its first leaf, before the Well of Earther filled with its first water, before the sky above was anything more than the dark promise of a shape that had not yet been made. The gods stand a little further back today than they did the day before. Fenrir is somewhere in the middle of the light, and the world continues in the shape it has always been, moving in the direction it was always moving, carrying inside its deep structure everything that the Norns have already carved, patient and still, and very old and entirely unhurried. The chain was heavy before anything happened with it. That fact is worth dwelling on for a moment, the simple physical weight of the thing, iron dark and cold, each link forged from metal that the gods themselves had worked and shaped. Whoever carried it across the ground of Asgarth would have felt that weight in their arms and hands. The links would have shifted against one another with a low, continuous sound, a sound that iron makes when it moves against itself, dense and dull and entirely without music. The chain was called lading, and it was the first attempt, and it had not been made to fail. The gods had brought it to Fenrir as a game. That is how the Gylfaginning records the scene, not as a display of force, not as an open act of restraint, but as a challenge presented to the wolf in the manner of a test of strength. The framing was important. Fenrir was not asked whether he would submit to a fetter. He was offered the opportunity to demonstrate something. In a tradition where strength and the recognition of strength carried genuine weight, this was not an empty distinction. The gods were not deceiving him in that first attempt, or not exactly. They were presenting the chain as a thing that might interest him in the way that a very large obstacle interests someone who has reason to believe they can move it. Fenrir studied the chain. The tradition does not record what passed across his expression, or whether his expression was the kind of thing a wolf could be said to have. What it records is that he looked at lading and decided it was worth accepting. He allowed the gods to place it on him. He stood still, or still enough, while the links were arranged and secured, and the weight of all that iron settled against his body with a sound like the closing of something heavy. Then he kicked it apart. The Gylfaginning does not dwell on the manner of it. The description is plain and brief and without drama. Fenrir strained, kicked outward against the fetter, and it broke. The link scattered. The iron that had taken effort and time to forge lay in pieces across the ground. The breaks in the metal would have been bright at their edges, the interior of each link exposed where the force had torn it, the way iron looks when something has exceeded what it was made to hold. Fenrir stood in the middle of it, and the chains that had rested against his sides a moment before were simply gone. Scattered things, pieces of a project that had not worked, lying where they had landed. The gods gathered the fact of this, the way one gathers any fact that has just become irreversible. Lading had failed. This was now a piece of knowledge that could not be unknowed. Whatever they decided to do next would have to begin from here. It is worth pausing on what they chose to do and what they chose not to do. They did not at this point send for the dwarves. They did not at this point conclude that the problem of Fenrir required a solution from outside the resources of Asgarth. What they did instead was make a larger chain. The logic of this is entirely recognizable. When something made in a particular way does not work, the immediate instinct is to make the same thing bigger, heavier, more of what it already was. The second chain was called Dromi. The prose Edda describes it as half again as strong as lading, and lading had itself been formidable by any ordinary measure, a chain that would have held most things that needed holding in the Norse world. Dromi was constructed to be more than lading in every dimension that mattered. Stronger, heavier, made with the understanding that lading had not been enough, and that more of the same quality that lading lacked was the correct correction. There is something patient and methodical in this. The gods of Asgarth were not, in this moment, acting in panic. They were applying craft and attention to a problem that had demonstrated a specific failure mode, and they were addressing that failure mode directly. Dromi was the serious attempt, made with full knowledge of what the first attempt had shown. If lading could be kicked apart without enormous effort, then the answer was a chain that could not be kicked apart, and the way to achieve that was to make the chain more difficult to kick apart. This is sound logic. It is also, as it turned out, the wrong kind of logic entirely. The presentation of Dromi to Fenrir followed the same form as the presentation of lading. The gods brought it as a challenge. The Gylfaginning records that they argued to the wolf that breaking a heavier chain would bring him even greater fame, that the glory of shattering something stronger than lading would be worth more than the glory of having shattered lading, which itself had been considerable. This argument had a shape that made sense within the logic of how strength and reputation worked in this tradition. Fame was a real thing. The demonstration of capacity had real value. If Fenrir had broken the first chain easily, the breaking of the second, harder, more resistant, more impressive in its weight and construction, would make an even clearer statement about what he was capable of. Fenrir looked at Dromi. He considered it. The Gylfaginning conveys a brief hesitation, not the easy acceptance he had shown with lading, but a moment of deliberation that suggests he recognized Dromi was different in degree from what had come before. He was not certain he could break it. The tradition records this with quiet directness. Fenrir thought about it, weighed the possibilities, and decided. He allowed the gods to place Dromi on him. What followed was different from the breaking of lading. Dromi did not shatter quickly or lightly. Fenrir strained against it, genuinely strained, the whole force of his body engaged, pulling against links that were built to resist exactly this kind of force. He shook himself. The Gylfaginning describes the violence of this. A great shaking, the body of the wolf throwing itself against the constraint with everything available to it. The iron of Dromi was not lading. It held longer. It resisted in a way that lading had not. And then it broke. The pieces of dromi scattered across a wide area, wider than the pieces of lading, because there had been more force involved, because the breaking had required more and therefore released more. The gods looked at the scattered iron. They looked at Fenrir, standing where the chain had been. They had now tried twice, with increasingly serious tools built from the same fundamental approach, and the result was the same result twice in a row: broken metal, a wolf unbound, and a problem that was larger than it had been the day before, because the wolf was still growing and they were running out of the kind of answer they had been giving. The old Norse expression that Snorri Sturluson preserves in the Gylfaginning, a phrase meaning roughly to loose from lading or to break dromi, was used in later speech as a way of referring to any undertaking of extreme difficulty. The two chains had become proverbial. They had passed from specific mythological events into the wider body of the language, becoming figures of speech that people reached for when they needed to describe something almost impossibly hard to achieve. This is one of the ways a story can be measured, not just in whether it is remembered, but in whether the objects and events within it become part of how a language thinks. Lading and dromi became that, long after the specific circumstances of their forging and their breaking had faded from everyday consciousness. The name survived as the shape of a concept, something as hard as breaking dromi, something as difficult as loosing from lading. The iron that failed to hold Fenrir became the way a language described the outer edges of what was achievable. After the failure of dromi, something shifted in the gods' approach. The Gylfaginning is clear on this. The assembled Aesir concluded explicitly that no chain made from ordinary materials, however massive, however carefully constructed, however much improved upon what had come before, could hold the wolf. This was not a tentative conclusion. It was a recognition, arrived at through two attempts with two serious tools, that the category of solution they had been working within was simply the wrong category. Fenrir could break iron. More iron would not change this. The constraint the gods needed was not a larger version of what they had already tried. It was something else entirely, something that did not work through physical mass or measurable strength, something that operated by different principles than the ones that governed how much weight a chain could bear before its links gave way. The recognition of this is interesting to sit with. There is a particular quality to the moment when a methodical approach reaches its limit, when the application of more of the same thing stops being a plausible strategy and something genuinely different is required. The gods of Asgard had done the reasonable thing twice. They had made a fetter and tested it. They had made a stronger fetter and tested that. Both had failed in the same fundamental way, which meant the failure was not about the quantity of force the chain could resist, but about something more basic, about whether the approach of building a physical restraint from physical materials was adequate to the nature of the thing being restrained. It was not. What the gods needed next was something that did not come from their own forges. The decision to send messengers to Svartalfheimr was therefore not a confident strategic pivot. The Gylfaginning presents it with a quality of near desperation, not wild panic, but the sober recognition of a group of beings who had exhausted their own resources and were now turning, with some urgency, to the only craftsman in the 9 worlds whose skill might operate in a register that ordinary material could not reach. The dwarves worked underground, in the deep places beneath the mapped surface of the cosmos, in a realm whose name meant the home of the dark elves. What they made had a quality that the forges of Asgard did not produce. The gods knew this. They had known it before, when they needed things they could not make themselves. Now they needed it again, for a different reason, and with more depending on the outcome. Before the messengers were prepared and sent, The gods spent some time with the fact of what they had just learned. The wolf had broken Dromi. The wolf was still growing. It had been growing steadily since the day the gods had brought it from Jotunheimr to Asgard, and nothing about the rate of that growth suggested it was going to slow. In the halls of Asgard, among the bright structures of the god's own realm, Fenrir moved and ate and continued to become larger. Every time the gods saw him, they were seeing a version of him that had not existed before, a slightly larger thing, a slightly more considerable presence, a creature whose scale was advancing past the scale of the world around it, in a way that regular observation made impossible to ignore. The space the gods kept between themselves and the wolf had also been growing. This is described in the Prose Edda with a kind of matter-of-fact economy. Most of the Aesir kept their distance, and only Tyr continued to approach Fenrir regularly, bringing food, maintaining the daily interaction that had been established when the young wolf first arrived in the realm of the gods. The distance the others kept was not discussed openly. There was no formal declaration that the Aesir would stand at this particular remove from Fenrir, and no closer. The space simply accumulated, the way distances accumulate when people do not speak about the reason they are moving back. The wolf grew. The space around him widened. Both of these things were true at the same time, and neither required explanation. Tyr's position in this arrangement is striking. He is described in the Prose Edda as the boldest of the Aesir, the one among all the gods who presided over matters of justice and legal assembly, whose authority in questions of sanctioned action was recognized by the other gods. And he is described as the one who kept walking toward the wolf when everyone else had stopped. There is no narration in the Gylfaginning of what this felt like for Tyr. There is no record of whether he moved toward Fenrir with ease or with difficulty, whether the act of continuing to approach was something he performed without particular cost, or something that required a specific decision each time. What the text records is simply that he went, and that the food was brought, and that this continued while the wolf grew, and the other gods held back. The messengers who were eventually dispatched to Svartalfheimr would have left Asgard and begun moving downward. The geography of the nine worlds in Norse cosmology is not a flat arrangement. It is a vertical structure as much as a horizontal one, with Asgarthur at a height and Svartalfheimr deep beneath the surface of things. In the places under the roots of Yggdrasil, where the great ash tree's base touched stone, and the stone went further down. Moving towards Svartalfheimr meant moving away from the light and space of the upper world and into something narrower and darker and older smelling. The stone would have been present in a way that stone is not present in the open air, not as a surface underfoot, but as the material through which movement had to be negotiated. The walls close on either side, the ceiling descending. The dwarf's skill is established through context in the Prose Edda well before the commission for any specific object. The sons of Ivaldi had made Skitblathnir, the ship that could sail any sea and be folded small enough to carry in a pocket, an object that requires two entirely incompatible qualities to coexist in the same thing, and that achieves this through craft rather than compromise. They had made the golden hair that replaced what had been taken from the goddess Sif. When the gods needed something that could not be obtained from ordinary making, the underground realm was where the commission went. This was an established pattern. The messengers descending towards Svartalfheim were following a route that had been traveled before, in service of needs that had been met before, by craftsmen whose ability to do what could not otherwise be done was already part of how the cosmos organized itself. What the commission called for this time was different in kind from previous requests. Not a weapon, not a ship, not a piece of jewelry, however magical. What the gods needed was a restraint, something that could hold what iron could not hold, something that operated on a principle entirely unlike the principle of a chain. The dwarves who received this commission would have understood immediately that the solution could not be built from ordinary materials. An ordinary restraint, made from extraordinary amounts of ordinary material, had already been attempted twice, and had failed twice. Whatever Svartalfaheimer was going to produce would have to be made from something else, from materials whose power came not from their mass, but from their nature. The name the Prose Edda gives to the fetter that came from this commission is Gleipnir. It would be described, when it was finished and carried back up toward the light, as a ribbon, smooth and soft and fine, something that could be held in an open hand without the hand feeling strained, something whose appearance gave no indication of what it was or what it could do. The appearance of Gleipnir is in some sense the opposite of lading and dromi. The two iron chains announced themselves. Their weight was their most obvious quality. Their size communicated something before they were even placed on anything. Gleipnir communicated nothing. It sat on whatever surface it rested on, as if it were a piece of cloth, a decorative element, something woven for ornament rather than function. Down in Svartalfheim, before the ribbon was finished, before the messengers prepared to carry it back upward through the stone and route toward the higher world, the craftsmen who made it worked in firelight, in the way the dwarves are always understood to work in the Norse tradition, close to the earth, deep in it, surrounded by the materials that the underground provides. The making of Gleipnir required ingredients that do not exist. This is the central fact about it, and it is important to hold that fact precisely. The 6 things from which Gleipnir was made, the sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird, are not rare or difficult to obtain. They are not present anywhere in the world to obtain. They are things that cannot be gathered because they are not things. The sound a cat's paw makes when it touches a surface. The roots that a mountain does not have because mountains are the roots of themselves. The beard that women do not grow. The breath that moves in and out of a fish without taking the form that breath takes in air. The spittle that a bird does not produce. These are not metaphors for obscure materials. They are the ingredients listed plainly in the Gylfaginning, things that do not exist, gathered together into something that does. The paradox of Gleipnir is not that it was made from strange things. It is that it was made from nothing, or from the absence of things, from the gaps where things might have been and are not. And from this collection of absences, the dwarves produced something present, something real, something that could be picked up and carried and felt in the hand and placed around the limbs of a wolf. What it looked like when it was finished was a ribbon. What it was in terms of what it could do was something that the strongest creature in the Norse cosmos could not break. The Gylfaginning records that the dwarves of Svartalfheimer made Gleipnir from these 6 components, and it records what Gleipnir looked like when it was done, and it does not elaborate at length on the process by which impossible ingredients are assembled into a physical object. This restraint is itself interesting. The text is not hiding anything. It gives the full list of ingredients and the description of the finished product, and it allows the gap between those 2 facts to stand without narration. How does one gather the sound of a cat's footstep? The tradition does not say. How does the absence of a mountain's roots become a material that can be woven or bound into a ribbon? The tradition does not say. The gap is left open and the finished object rests across it, fine, smooth, indistinguishable from something decorative, entirely capable of holding what 2 serious iron chains had failed to hold. The reason that this worked in the logic of the Norse mythological tradition has to do with a principle that appears elsewhere in the Prose Edda's accounts of dwarven craft. The things that dwarves made for the gods were not more powerful versions of the tools the gods could make for themselves. They were different in kind, operating by principles that ordinary construction could not access, drawing on a quality of making that was available only underground, in the realm created from the body of the primordial giant, by beings who were themselves products of that same primal material. Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, was not simply a better hammer than any hammer the gods could forge in Asgard. It did things that hammers do not do. Gungnir, Odin's spear, did not miss. These are not improvements on ordinary weapons. They are objects that have departed from the category of ordinary weapons entirely and become something else, tools whose power is categorical rather than scalar. Gleipnir was this, applied to the specific problem of restraint. The question of holding Fenrir could not be answered with more iron because more iron operated in the same category as less iron, and that category had been tried and found inadequate. The answer had to come from outside the category entirely, from something that did not function through mass and tensile strength and the measurable resistance of a physical material. Gleipnir functioned through the absence of the things it was made from. Things that do not exist cannot be broken by force that is applied to things that do. The wolf could strain against a fetter until his body reached the outer limit of what his body could produce, and nothing would give way because there was nothing there to give way in the physical sense. What held him was not a material that was stronger than his muscles. What held him was a material that was not a material in the way he could address with muscles at all. Before the ribbon was carried back up toward Asgard, it rested somewhere in Svartalfheimr, perhaps on a stone surface, or held in an open hand. It would have looked unremarkable against the rough walls of the underground realm, smooth and pale and fine, the firelight passing over it without catching on any edge, because there were no edges to catch. Nothing about it communicated danger, nothing about it communicated power, nothing about it communicated that it was the answer to the problem that two broken iron chains had demonstrated was not going to solve itself. It looked like something that could be snapped with two fingers. It lay there, completed, waiting to be carried back toward the world where the problem it was made to solve was still growing larger. The messengers who had come down to Svartalfheimr with a commission would return with a ribbon. The weight difference between what they had arrived with, the concept of a chain, the idea of iron, and what they would carry back would have been almost nothing. The hands that bore Gleipnir upward through the stone, toward the increasing light, toward the smell of air that had been in the sky rather than underground, would have felt almost nothing in them. The most consequential object being moved through the Norse cosmos at that moment was so light it might as well not have been there. This is one of the things the story seems to understand about itself, that power does not announce its presence through weight or size or the sound of heavy links moving against one another, that the thing which can hold what nothing else could hold might arrive looking like nothing at all. The iron chains had announced themselves. Lading had been heavy in the arms of whoever carried it. Dromi had been heavier still. Both had failed. Gleipnir had no weight to announce. It came from a place where things were made from absences, and it arrived in the world of the gods as something that seemed, until the moment it was tested, to be the least impressive solution that had yet been attempted. The two failed chains lay somewhere, scattered across the ground of Asgard, where they had landed when Fenrir shattered them, or gathered up and set aside, their pieces now objects without a purpose. The broken ends of lading, the wider scatter of Dromi, which had required more force to break, and had therefore spread further when it went, iron that had been made with care and then exceeded. The tradition does not record what became of the pieces. They were no longer part of the story once they were broken, except as evidence of the problem, as the physical demonstration of what ordinary force could do when it exceeded ordinary material, and of why ordinary material was not the correct answer. The messengers with Gleipnir moved upward through the layers of the world, carrying a ribbon, passing from the underground dark of Svartalfaheimer back toward the surface. The stone around them would have changed as they ascended, become less close, let in more light from above, let in the smell of open air in place of the mineral density of the deep realm. Eventually there would have been sky. Eventually there would have been the breadth of the upper world, the particular quality of light that exists only when it is not being filtered through rock, the feeling of ground underfoot that had not been made from the body of something older than the world itself. And above all of this, waiting in Asgarth, the wolf continued to be what he was, large and growing, and fed each day by the one god who still came close enough to do it, while the others maintained their careful distance, and the question of what would finally hold him remained for a little while longer as still open. The messengers arrived with Gleipnir, and the ribbon rested in Asgarth now, soft and still, and entirely unimpressive to look at, in the realm where the problem was. The broken iron had been the wrong kind of answer. This was another kind of answer entirely, made from nothing, light as cloth, carrying inside its impossible composition the accumulated craft of the deepest and most skillful makers in the 9 worlds. Whatever came next would not require more iron. What had been made in the underground, from things that could not be gathered, was already here, and the question of what it would hold and what it would cost to use it was already quietly beginning to settle into place. The stone of Svartalfaheimer was far below, and the firelight in which Gleipnir had been made was far below, and the dwarves who had assembled absence into presence had returned to whatever work came after. The ribbon existed. The wolf existed. The gods of Asgarth moved through their realm with the awareness of both. Somewhere in the geography of what would happen next, a dark lake sat in the Norse cosmos with a small island at its center, and the heather on that island moved in whatever wind crossed the water, and the stones of the ground beneath it lay where they had always been, undisturbed, waiting with the patient stillness of things that have not yet been asked to hold anything, while the messengers from the deep world came up through the last of the earth and arrived with what the forges of Asgarth could not have made. The messengers arrived in Svartalfaheimer the way everything arrives in deep places, slowly, descending by degrees, the light from above thinning and then disappearing altogether until the only light that remained was the light from below. It came from forges, long horizontal smears of orange and red reflected in stone walls that were close enough on either side to touch, ceilings that were lower than the ones in Asgarth, corridors that turned without warning and opened into chambers where the air moved with heat from furnaces that had not been let to cool in a very long time. The smell was of mineral earth and hot iron and something older underneath those things, the smell of the stone itself, which had been here before the forges, and before the dwarves, and before almost everything except the body from which the world was made. The messengers from Asgarth stood at the threshold of that underground realm and looked in at the firelight and understood, in the way that new places communicate themselves all at once, that they had arrived somewhere different in kind from where they had come. Svartalfaheimer. The name holds the sense of the place in the way that names in these traditions sometimes do. The home of the dark elves, the Svartalfar, which is what the old sources call the dwarves, who inhabit this lowest of the inhabited realms beneath Asgarth. Dark elves, not from malice but from location, from the simple fact that they live where the sun does not reach and have lived there since before there was very much else to speak of. For the Prose Edda, which Snorri Sturluson compiled in Iceland around 1220 CE from older materials, he was careful to preserve even when they conflicted with one another, holds that the dwarves came into being from the flesh of Ymir, the primordial giant from whose body the gods made the world when they slew him at the beginning of measurable time. Ymir's blood became the seas, his bones the mountains, his skull the dome of the sky. From the maggots that formed in his flesh, the tradition holds, came the first dwarves, creatures of the earth in the most direct and literal sense, beings whose origins lie not in any act of divine formation, but in the substance of the world itself. In this, the dwarves are older, in a particular way, than almost anything else the tradition describes. They came from the world's body before the world had been assembled. This is worth holding for a moment. The commission the messengers carried to Svartalfheimr was addressed, in effect, to craftsmen who were made from the same material as mountains, who had been working in firelight in underground chambers since before the nine worlds had taken their present shape, who were familiar, in a practical way, with stone and bone and root and the kinds of forces that move through the earth without becoming visible at the surface. When the Aesir needed something that no ordinary iron could accomplish, they turned to beings whose entire existence had been conducted at the level where ordinary categories begin to loosen. This was not the gods seeking help from their inferiors. This was the gods seeking help from craftsmen who operated according to principles the gods themselves could not replicate. The records of what the dwarves had already made for the gods of Asgarth are long enough that they constitute something close to a tradition within the tradition. The sons of Ivaldi, a group of dwarf craftsmen named in the Prose Edda, were responsible for Skidbladnir, described as a ship that could carry all the gods across any sea and be folded when the gods had no more use for it that day, down to a size that fit inside a pocket. The same craftsman fashioned the golden hair that would grow like real hair once placed on the head of the goddess Sif, after Loki had cut away the original. These were not modest achievements. Skidbladnir sailing any sea on any wind, folding to fit inside a hand. This is not a larger or more efficient version of an ordinary ship. It is a ship that operates by different principles, built by craftsmen who understood something about the nature of scale and material and power that the gods who used it could not have understood well enough to make it themselves. This is the mythological convention that the tradition had established long before Fenrir arrived in Asgarth and long before the iron chains lading and dromi were found to be inadequate to what the gods needed. When the gods reached the limit of what they could accomplish with their own resources, the story of where to look for more was already in place. Mjolnir had come from Svartalfheimr as well. The tradition names the brothers Sindri and Brokr as its makers, a commission undertaken in the context of a wager with Loki, who had promised the dwarves his head if their three gifts to the gods turned out to be superior to those of the sons of Ivaldi. Sindri and Brokr made Draupnir, a gold ring that reproduced itself by producing 8 equally weighted gold rings every 9th night. They made Gullinbursti, the golden boar, whose mane and bristles shone so that it illuminated whatever darkness it moved through. And they made Mjolnir, the hammer that became Thor's principal weapon and the most effective tool the gods possessed for keeping the giants of Jotunheimr from pressing in on the ordered world. Mjolnir's handle was slightly shorter than intended. Loki, during the forging had taken the shape of a fly and bitten Broker on the eyelid while he worked the bellows, and the interruption had cost the hammer something in its proportions. Even so, Mjolnir was voted the supreme gift, and Loki managed to keep his head through a contractual argument, the imperfect product of an interrupted process, and still the most important weapon among the gods. This is what dwarf craft looked like at less than its full potential. The commission for Gleipnir was different from anything the dwarves had been asked to make before. Lightning had been iron, Dromi had been iron, half again as strong. Both had failed, and the gods gathered after Dromi's failure knew why, because whatever strength Fenrir contained was not the kind of strength that iron held by mass or thickness could resist. When the wolf strained against Dromi, he strained against physical constraint, and what he had was more physical force than the iron could absorb. More iron would not answer, heavier chain would not answer. What the gods needed was a fetter that worked by a different principle, something that would not meet force with force, but would instead answer force by becoming more itself. Something that held, not because of what it was made of, but because of how it had been made. The dwarves understood this. The messengers from Asgard had descended into Svartalfheimr, carrying a problem that their own world could not solve, and what they found in the firelight below was the particular attention of craftsmen who had been thinking about material and principle for a very long time. What would be needed, the tradition holds, was a fetter made not from iron at all, but from things that did not exist, things that had existed or might have existed, but which were by definition no longer findable in the world as it stood. The reasoning has its own coherence, once the terms are accepted. If what needed to be bound was something unprecedented, a creature of such force that ordinary categories of strength could not hold it, then what would hold it could not be made from ordinary categories of material. It would have to be made from something that had already passed out of the world, or that had never fully entered it, or that was real in a different register from stone and iron and the things that hands can ordinarily reach. The Gylfaginning names the 6 components of Gleipnir, and the list is one of the more particular passages in the prose Edda. The sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird, each one named plainly, without elaboration, in the way that a recipe might list ingredients, matter of fact about things that are, in the literal sense, nowhere to be found. A cat's footstep makes no sound. Cats walk without producing one. A woman's beard does not exist. Women do not have beards. Mountains have no roots in the way that trees have roots, nothing underground to which they are anchored by fibers that can be separated and gathered. Bears have sinews, but the specific sinews of a bear as a defined extractable material. The tradition seems to suggest something that has been taken out of bears and is therefore no longer in them, belonging to a category of thing that has been used up. The breath of a fish is not breath in any sense that can be held and measured. Fish do not breathe air and produce no exhalation that can be gathered. The spittle of a bird is not produced. Birds do not salivate in ways that result in spittle. The logic here is not difficult once the premise is granted. These are things that either never existed in the first place, in the way that human language sometimes generates categories for which no instance can be found, or things that once existed and have been entirely exhausted from the world, leaving nothing behind. They are absences. The dwarves of Svartalfheim were asked to make something from things that were not there, and the result of making something from what is not there is something that behaves by different rules from things made of ordinary material. Gleipnir would not respond to force in the way that iron responds to force. It could not be snapped or burst or scattered. It had been made from what does not exist, and so what exists, even a wolf of unprecedented size and strength, could not undo it. The dwarves worked in their firelit chambers, in the heat of furnaces that had been burning since before much of the world above them had taken shape, and they made Gleipnir. The prose Edda describes the result as a smooth and soft ribbon, fine as a silk band, light enough to hold in an open palm without weight. This was the thing that would hold the great wolf of Jotunheim. This was what the gods had sent to Svartalfheimr for, and what they would carry back up through stone corridors and out into the light of the upper world. A ribbon, pale and fine, and entirely unimpressive to look at. The kind of object that might be found on a dress or wrapped around a gift, something a child could snap between two fingers on an idle afternoon. This was what the dwarves had made from impossibilities, and the appearance of it was inseparable from the principle by which it had been constructed, because the things from which it was made had no physical presence in the world. The thing made from them also carried no visible evidence of its strength. What is made from the sound of a cat's footstep is going to look like very little. What is made from the roots of a mountain is not going to look like a mountain. There is a particular pleasure in this, if it is allowed to settle. The tradition describing Gleipnir is not trying to be mysterious for its own sake. The logic runs straight through it. Force requires something to push against. What Gleipnir offered was nothing to push against, not a physical substance with tensile limits, but a material whose nature was not organized along the lines that force knows how to address. A wolf straining against a silk ribbon is doing something completely different from a wolf straining against iron, even if the wolf cannot see the difference until the ribbon simply holds. The dwarves had given the gods a solution that worked because it was made from a different kind of real in the way that the sound of a cat's footstep is real, as a phenomenon, even though it produces no detectable trace. Real in the way that the roots of a mountain are real as a concept, a structural principle, even though no one has ever touched them. The craft that produced this was not a magic separate from everything else the dwarves had made. It was the same craft that produced Skidbladnir, the ship that sailed every sea and folded to fit a pocket. Skidbladnir worked by a principle not available to ordinary shipbuilders, by an understanding of scale and material that let enormous things be compressed without loss into a very small form. Gleipnir worked by the opposite principle. Something very small, something that looked like nothing at all, opened outward into a containment that was effectively limitless. The dwarves, who had been making things from the substance of Ymir's body since before the gods had fully assembled, the 9 worlds were craftsmen who understood, in a practical way, that the relationship between what a thing looks like and what a thing can do is not fixed, that the most effective tools are often the ones that do not advertise their function, that what holds best is not what presses hardest, but what responds differently from how force expects to be met. Draupnir reproduced itself every 9th night, 8 identical gold rings from one, without diminishment, the original ring no lighter or less itself, for having made 8 more. This too is a dwarf-made object, operating by a principle that ordinary metalwork cannot reproduce. You do not make 8 rings by making one, unless the one was made in Svartalfheimr, Gungnir. Odin's spear was described in the tradition as a weapon that never missed its mark, which is to say, it was accurate, not by virtue of the skill of the thrower, but because something in its construction aimed it. These are objects that contain within their making a logic that extends beyond the moment of their use. Gleipnir is the same kind of object. The dwarves had not simply made a very thin and very strong rope. They had made a fetter that understood the thing it was meant to hold. The firelight in Svartalfheim did not change very much during the making of Gleipnir. Forges burn at the same temperature, whether they are making a gold ring that reproduces itself, or a ship that changes size, or a ribbon that holds what iron cannot. The dwarves who worked the bellows and shaped whatever form those impossible materials took in the process of being made were doing something continuous with the rest of their work. The underground realm produced objects of this kind as a matter of course, and the commission from Asgarth was unusual in its stakes rather than in its nature. What the gods needed urgently was something the dwarves already knew how to think about. The urgency was the gods. The problem was an interesting one, but it was the kind of interesting problem that comes to craftsmen who have been working for a very long time and who do not waste attention on things they cannot solve. When Gleipnir was finished, it was placed on a surface. Stone, probably, cool and flat, the rough grain of it, a contrast to the smoothness of the ribbon lying on top, and it looked exactly like what it looked like. A silk band, something decorative, if anything at all. The firelight of the forges caught it, and nothing in the ribbon's appearance changed, to indicate that it was made from the sound of a cat's footstep, from the roots of mountains, from the breath of fish, and the spittle of birds, and the beard that women do not have, and the sinews already gone from bears. None of those things were visible. They were present, but not in a form that appearance could access. There is a version of the Norse tradition's relationship with craft that becomes clearest at this point, in the specific image of Gleipnir lying on a flat stone in a dwarf forge before it has been carried anywhere. The tradition associated the deepest powers not with the loudest or most obviously impressive objects, not with the biggest hammer or the heaviest chain, but with objects that contained their power in a concentrated and invisible form, legible only in what they did, rather than in what they were. Mjolnir, the most effective weapon among the gods, was slightly shorter in the handle than intended, and had been made from an interrupted process. Skidbladnir, the finest ship in the 9 worlds, could be folded to fit in a pocket. Gleipnir, which would hold the wolf, who would grow until he had outgrown every iron chain the gods could forge, looked like a ribbon. The tradition seems to hold that the relationship between power and appearance is almost always inverse, that the thing which will finally accomplish what nothing else could accomplish will look, when someone picks it up, like very little. The messengers from Asgarth who had descended into Svartalfheim with a problem looked at what they had been given and understood that the dwarves had done the thing they had come for. The ribbon was placed with care into whatever was used to carry it, held gently, because it was delicate looking, and because the object that has been made from the sound of a cat's footstep seems like the kind of thing worth handling, without roughness, even if its actual strength is theoretically unlimited. They turned back toward the corridor that would take them upward, back through the stone and the narrowing light, back toward the surface of the world, where the problem that had sent them here was still present and still growing. The stone walls of Svartalfheim passed on either side as they ascended. The forges fell behind them, and the heat diminished by degrees, the smell of iron cooling, and the mineral smell of rock becoming the dominant thing. Higher up, as the corridor opened and the ceiling rose and the quality of the air began to change from underground to surface, the sound of the forge, which is never entirely silent even at this distance, the bellows and the work below continuing without pause, grew quieter. Then it was only the sound of the corridor itself, which was stone and did not make a sound. Then they were above ground. The ribbon from Svartalfheim was pale and fine in the surface light, indistinguishable in appearance from what it had looked like underground. Nothing about bringing it into sunlight revealed anything new. It was smooth to the touch and very light, and it lay without drama in the hand of whoever carried it, giving no sign of the six things it had been made from, no visible index of the strength the dwarves had concentrated into it. Gleipnir. The name would remain in the tradition for centuries, preserved in the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, carried through the manuscripts that survived the long transition from the Norse oral tradition to the written record. The Codex Regius, that medieval Icelandic manuscript dated to approximately 1270 CE, holds these stories in a hand that was already copying material several hundred years older than the vellum it marked. The name Gleipnir is in there, in ink, in the same passage that lists the sound of a cat's footstep and the beard of a woman and the roots of a mountain. The impossible ingredients of the only fetter that would work are written down in an archive that has been sitting in various locations since the 13th century. The words unchanged, the ribbon they describe long since deployed and long since holding. What the messengers carried back up from Svartalfaheimer was, in the accounting of the tradition, the solution to the problem the gods had been building toward since they brought the young wolf of Jotunheimer to Asgarth and watched him grow in their halls. Lading had been iron. Dromi had been iron, half again as strong, and it had scattered in pieces across the ground. Gleipnir was made from things that no longer existed in the world, and it sat in a hand on the way back to Asgarth, looking like something that had been used to tie a package closed. The logic of what the dwarves had made was complete. The tradition did not need to dress it up or make it look more impressive than it appeared. The strangeness of the six ingredients was itself the argument. What you make from nothing that pushes back cannot be resisted by pushing. Asgarth was above. The island of Lingvai, set in the dark water of the lake Amsvartnir, was above. Fenrir was above, somewhere in the light of the upper world, growing with the steady indifference of a thing that had not yet been told what would hold it. The ribbon Gleipnir rested on its way back up through the 9 worlds, the way very small and very important things rest, quietly, taking up almost no space, carrying inside it the concentrated labor of craftsmen who had been working in firelight since before the mountains had their present form. In the underground realm, behind the ascending messengers, in Svartalfaheimer, the forges continued. The bellows worked. The hammers came down on whatever was being made next. The dwarves who had made Gleipnir from 6 impossible things were already doing something else, because craftsmen of this kind do not pause between commissions. The commission from Asgarth had been an interesting one, a fetter for a creature who could not be held by iron, made from things that had no material form, but interesting commissions come to those who have been working long enough, and the dwarves of Svartalfaheimer had been working since before almost anything else in the tradition had taken its shape. The firelight went on in the chambers below. The stone walls held the heat. The anvils rang in the deep place where beings who were made from the body of Ymir practiced their particular craft on material that no one above them could work. And on a surface somewhere in those chambers, before the messengers had climbed all the way out of hearing, there would have been nothing left of Gleipnir to see. The ribbon had gone with the ones who carried it. Only the cool, flat stone on which it had rested after its making, indistinguishable from any other stone in Svartalfheim, holding no trace of the thing that had lain across it, except perhaps the faint impression of something very light and very smooth that had been placed there briefly before being carried away to the world above. Gleipnir moved upward through the stone, and the corridors and the diminishing smell of the forge, held with care by hands that understood they were carrying something the dwarves had not made before, something that worked by a principle that could not be explained by pointing to its surface. Pale as silk, light as something that barely exists, made from what is not there, for the purpose of holding what is very much there, and growing, and waiting in the halls of Asgarth with the patient enormity of a creature whose nature had been clear to the gods from the beginning, and whose containment had taken everything the nine worlds had to offer before it was finally, quietly solved. The solution was coming. It was traveling upward through the stone. It was carrying itself in the hands of those who had been sent to retrieve it, unimpressive in the way that only things made from impossibilities can be unimpressive, because they have nothing to prove to appearance, having already settled the question at a level that appearance cannot access. And on the surface of a flat stone in the deep forge chambers of Svartalfaheim, where the ribbon had lain for a moment after being finished, and before being carried away, there was only stone, cool and still and unremarkable. The forges burned on, the work continued. Below everything, in the oldest inhabited part of the Norse cosmos, in the realm made from the world's own body, the dwarves went on making. The lake Amsvartnir lay dark and still, its surface the color of iron that has been left in the rain. Somewhere near its center, just visible through the low mist that sat on the water without moving, was the island of Lyngvi, a small, flat, heather-covered place with no great trees on it, and no paths leading anywhere, the kind of island that a traveler passing on the water would not stop for, would barely register, would let slide behind them in the mist, and forget before the shore came into view. The heather grew low across it. The ground beneath the heather was cold. Nothing marked it as a place where anything of consequence had happened, or was about to. The gods had chosen it for that quality, among others. An island surrounded by deep water offered a particular kind of boundary, not a wall, not a chain, but a gap, a distance of cold water and low visibility that would lie between the gods and whatever happened next if what happened next was not what they intended. The water did not move. The mist did not lift. The island of Lyngvi sat in the middle of the dark lake, with the patience of a thing that had been there long before the gods arrived, with their boats, and their silk ribbon, and their purpose, and that would be there long after whatever was going to happen on its surface had finished. The Norse tradition, as it is preserved in the Gylfaginning, the section of Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, compiled in 13th century Iceland, that tells this story in its fullest surviving form, does not describe the journey across the water in great detail. What it records is the arrival, the gods on the island, the wolf among them, and the ribbon Gleipnir brought along as though it were a thing of no particular importance. And it records something else as well. It records that when Fenrir looked at the ribbon, he was not immediately willing to allow it to be placed on him. He was willing to consider it. He stood and he looked at it, and the looking was already a kind of understanding. Gleipnir, in the account the Prose Edda preserves, appeared to be a smooth silk band, soft, pale, fine enough that a steady hand could hold it without feeling much weight. Against the heather of Lyngvi, against the stone and the dark water surrounding the island, it would have looked like something ornamental, something made for a wrist or a hall post, something without force. The two iron chains that had been placed on Fenrir before this, lading and then dromi, one half again as strong as the other, both broken without great difficulty, had at least looked like what they were. They had been heavy and dark and linked, and they had made the sound that iron makes when it is dragged across stone. Gleipnir made no sound. It lay still on the ground of Lyngvi, and it looked like nothing. Fenrir understood this in a way the gods had not quite anticipated. The Gylfaginning records his reasoning plainly. If the ribbon was as slight as it appeared, then breaking it would bring him no fame, no recognition of strength, no reason to have submitted to it at all. And if it was not as slight as it appeared, if something had been done to it, If it had been made by craft that he could not see, then allowing it to be placed on him would be a different kind of risk entirely. He looked at it and he understood both things, and he told the gods that he would not allow the ribbon to be placed on him unless one of them would consent to hold a hand inside his mouth during the binding as a pledge of good faith, a surety, a guarantee that this was what they said it was, and that if they had deceived him, there would be a cost. The practice of placing a hand in pledge was not invented for this story. It was embedded in the older structures of Norse social and legal practice, in the understanding that a promise made with the hand placed in another's grip was a promise that could not be unmade without consequence, and that to accept that physical surety was to accept a stake in the outcome. Fenrir was not making an unusual demand. He was applying a familiar form to an unfamiliar situation, asking the gods to put something of their own into the arrangement if they wanted him to put himself into it. It was, in its way, a reasonable request. The gods stood on the island of Lyngvi, and they considered it, and in the consideration there was a long pause, and in the pause the mist continued to sit on the water, and the heather continued to grow low across the ground, and none of them moved forward. Tyr, in the tradition of the Aesir, held a particular position. The Prose Edda names him as the boldest of the gods, the one who presided over legal gatherings, who sanctioned martial justice, who gave his name to one of the days of the Norse week in the same way that Odin and Thor and Frigg gave their names to others. He was associated with the proper resolution of conflict, with the agreement that holds even when it costs something, with the form that prevents the descent into endless reprisal. He was, by the understanding the Norse tradition preserves, precisely the god one would want, present when a legal pledge needed to be made, and someone needed to take the stake that no one else would take. The Gylfaginning records simply that no other god volunteered. It records this without embellishment, without offering an explanation for why each of the others remained still. It simply notes that Tyr was the one who moved. He walked forward on the island of Lyngvi, while the other gods remained where they were, and the distance between where he had been standing and where Fenrir waited was not described as long or as short, only as crossed. Tyr placed his right hand in Fenrir's mouth. The hand went in, the jaws closed gently around it as a surety rather than a bite, and the binding began. What happened next followed quickly. The gods placed Gleipnir on Fenrir, laying the fine silk ribbon across his legs and around his body, and the wolf tested it in the way he had tested the iron chains, first a shake, then a harder pulling, then the full engagement of his strength against the thing that held him. Lading had separated at the first kick. Dromi had held for a moment, and then burst apart. Gleipnir did something different. The more Fenrir strained against it, the tighter it became. This was the nature of what the dwarves had made in Svartalfheim, not a chain that resisted force by being heavier than force, but something that answered force by increasing its own hold, the binding feeding on the energy put into breaking it and returning that energy as constraint. Fenrir pulled, and Gleipnir held. He pulled harder, and it held more completely. The enormous body of the wolf was brought down into the heather of the island, not by being overpowered, but by being answered, the ribbon simply receiving everything directed against it and giving none of it back. When Fenrir understood that the ribbon would hold, when the understanding arrived, through the straining and the failed breaking, that something had been done to this thing that could not be undone by strength alone, he closed his jaws. Tyr's right hand was severed at the wrist. The Gylfaginning records that the other gods laughed. It records this alongside the statement that Tyr did not laugh, having lost his hand, and then it continues to the next detail of the binding. The laughter and the loss are placed in the same sentence with the same weight, neither inflated into commentary, neither minimized. Something costly and something triumphant occurred in the same moment on the same island. The tradition preserves both without asking the listener to choose which one matters more. The cost to tear was permanent and specific. He had been the one who moved forward. He had placed the stake. He had stood with his hand in the wolf's mouth through the length of the binding, and when the binding held and the deception was understood, he received the consequence that he had known was possible when he moved forward. The prose Edda does not describe his reaction in detail. It does not give him words. It names the loss, the right hand at the wrist, and moves on to the remainder of the binding, the way the old sources move through irreversible things, with the calm acknowledgement that what has happened, and the story continues from there. The word Gleipnir is thought by scholars to carry a sense of the opening, of something that opens, a slight irony, given that what the ribbon does is close and tighten and hold. The ribbon itself, lying on the ground of Lyngvi after the binding, would have been even harder to see clearly than it was before, wound now around the body of the wolf, indistinguishable in texture from the kind of decorative banding used in the halls of Asgard. Nothing about its appearance announced what it contained. Nothing about it looked like the thing that had just accomplished what two iron chains could not. The gods were not finished. Having brought Fenrir down into the heather with Gleipnir, they secured the arrangement further. A large boulder called Gjöll, a name associated with a clamorous or echoing sound, the same name given to the river at the edge of Niflheim, was threaded with the cord of Gleipnir and driven deep into the ground of the island, anchored by a second stone called Fiti, placed flat on top of the first as a kind of cap or weight. The cord ran between the fetter on Fenrir's body and the stone in the ground, and the stone went deep enough that the pulling of the wolf against it would be the pulling of a wolf against the weight of the island itself, against whatever lay beneath the island in the cold, dark ground below Amsvartnir, and still they were not finished. The wolf's jaws, forced open during the straining against the ribbon, were propped that way by the insertion of a sword between them, the hilt placed against the lower jaw, the point pressed upward against the upper palate, so that Fenrir lay in the heather with his mouth held open and the blade between his teeth, the sword gambitine standing upright in that open mouth, the wolf unable to close his jaws completely around anything. The saliva that ran from the open mouth of the wolf fell to the earth of the island and became, in the tradition's account, the river Von, whose name carries the sense of hope or expectation, the slow water of waiting. Lyngvi, after the binding was complete, would have looked from any distance like it had looked before, a low island in a dark lake, heather-covered, unremarkable. The gods moved back toward their boats. The sound of the water was present and continuous as they crossed back toward the shore, the same sound it had been when they arrived, the same dark surface, the same mist sitting without moving above the lake. The island grew smaller behind them as they rowed, and the details of it, the heather, the stones, the cord running from fetter to boulder, the sword standing upright between open jaws, all resolved back into the general shape of a low island in a lake too small to read at this distance, disappearing into the mist. What the tradition holds, in the account Snorri Sturluson set down in the 13th century, from older sources already several hundred years deep, is that Fenrir lies bound on Lyngvi still, or that Fenrir lay bound on Lyngvi in the cosmological present of the myth, which is a kind of perpetual holding pattern, the wolf neither free nor dead but contained, the ribbon soft and tight around his body, the sword in his open mouth, the river Von running from his jaws into the earth of the island. Time, in this framework, passes differently in the deep geography of the Norse cosmos. The 9 worlds sit in the branches and roots of Yggdrasil, the great ash tree, and within that structure, certain things persist, not by enduring time, but by existing outside it in some fundamental way. The Norns at the Well of Earther, Hel in her quiet kingdom, and Fenrir on his island, all of them holding a position in the structure of the cosmos that will be maintained until the structure changes entirely. The Norse understanding of Orlog, the primal layer of fate laid down at the beginning of existence, binding upon gods and monsters alike, shaped the way this binding was understood even as it was being accomplished. The gods knew, or had known for long enough, that the knowing had settled into something like acceptance, that the binding on Lingvi was not a permanent solution in the absolute sense. It was a hold, a delay, a structure that would persist as long as the structure persisted. The Norns at the Well of Earth had already carved what they carved. The arrangement on Lingvi was not in contradiction of that. It was part of it, a link in the same chain, the delay that the fate itself contained within its pattern. When the arrangement ends, it will end because the larger arrangement ends, and both are already written in the same place and in the same hand. This does not make the binding small. It is one of the defining acts of the Norse pantheon, one of the arrangements that held the shape of the cosmos in place long enough for the worlds to be what they were. Treasures' hand was given in the service of something that held. The gesture did not prevent what was coming. No gesture could prevent what the Norns had already settled, but it contributed to the shape of the interval, to the particular quality of the held time between the binding and the unbinding, which was also the held time of the entire Norse mythological age. The myths that survive from that tradition are the myths of that interval, the stories told while the wolf lay bound in the heather, and the sword stood upright in his open jaws, and the dark water of Amsvartnir lay still and unreflective around the island of Lingvi. The gods returned to Asgarth from the island. The Prose Edda does not describe a celebration, does not dwell in relief. The gods of the Norse tradition existed always within the knowledge of Urlug, the understanding that what had been done was not so much a victory as a temporary resolution, the kind that the structure of fate includes within itself and does not contradict. Odin, who sat with the full weight of foreknowledge already settled in him, would have registered the return with the same equanimity he brought to everything, not indifferent, but not deceived into comfort either. The ravens Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, would have gone out and come back and leaned close to his ears and told him what they had seen, and what they told him would have been consistent with what he already knew. The wolf lay bound, the interval continued. Terror returned without his right hand. The tradition does not follow him further in this story. It moves past the loss with the same calm efficiency it applied to recording it, noting the cost and then setting it down. What can be said is that the god of legal assembly, of sanctioned justice, of the pledge made in good faith, even when the pledge is costly, lost the hand he placed in Fenrir's mouth when he was the only one who placed it. That act and that loss are bound up together in the Norse understanding of what it means to stand surety for something that matters. The pledge required a stake. The stake was given, the binding held. The sword Gambantine, standing between the wolf's open jaws on the island of Lingvi, is named in the Norse sources in a few different places, in contexts that suggest the name belonged to an important and specifically identified blade rather than a generic sword. Its placement in Fenrir's mouth, hilt against lower jaw, point against upper palate, holding the jaws apart so that the wolf could neither bite nor close his mouth fully, is a detail that has the quality of old specific memory, the kind of detail that persists in oral transmission because it is strange enough and precise enough to fix in the mind. Someone, somewhere in the long chain of transmission that led eventually to Snorri Sturluson's inkwork in the 13th century, knew the name of the sword and knew what was done with it, and held that detail together with the rest of the story, long enough for it to arrive in the Gylfaginning with its particularity intact. The River Von runs from the wolf's mouth. The name means hope or expectation in Old Norse, the slow water that falls from Fenrir's open jaws and runs across the ground of the island and into the lake. It is one of the quietly strange details that the Norse tradition produces without commentary, a thing that simply is a river born from the saliva of a bound wolf, named for the thing that sustains endurance, hope, the forward expectation of change. The tradition offers no interpretation of the name. It names the river and moves on, leaving the resonance to develop on its own in the mind of whoever is holding the story. Across the Norse cosmos, in those deep descriptions preserved in the Eddas, there is a quality of attention to the edges of things, to the far reaches of Jotunheimr, to the roots of Yggdrasil in Niflheim, to the island of Lyngvi sitting in the middle of Amsvartnir, to the place at the boundary between one age and the next, where the things that hold the structure in place are anchored. The binding of Fenrir is one of those anchoring acts, and Lyngvi is one of those edge places, a low island in a dark lake that holds a position in the geography of the mythological cosmos that no grander location was given. The heather grows there, the water surrounds it, the stones sit deep in the ground below it, the sword stands between open jaws in the middle of it, and the island does not look like anything from the water. It looks like a place where nothing has happened and nothing will, and that quality is the point of it, the specific choice the gods made when they chose it, a place that holds everything and announces nothing. The Codex Regius, the vellum manuscript dated to approximately 1270 CE, in which the oldest surviving poems of the Poetic Edda were preserved, contains the Völuspá, the great cosmological poem that names Fenrir among the forces that will be loosed at the end of the age. That poem looks past the binding to what comes after it, as it looks past everything to what comes after everything, because that is what the Völuspá is for. But it does not look past the binding without implying its existence. The loosing requires the binding, the release requires the restraint, and the wolf at Ragnarok is the wolf who was bound first, on the island, in the heather, with the ribbon that looked like nothing. The Gylfaginning, where the fullest narrative of the binding survives, is part of a work assembled by a man who was already working at some distance from the living tradition, a Christian scholar in 13th century Iceland, setting down with careful attention a body of mythological material that had been transmitted for generations before his pen touched the page, through the long northern centuries of oral transmission that preceded the manuscript tradition, through the particular form that Viking Age culture gave to the stories of the Aesir. Snorri was preserving something already old when he wrote it, and what he preserved was itself a version of something older still, in the same way that every telling of a myth stands over a depth of prior telling that goes back further than the first written word. What persists across that depth, in the story of the binding of Fenrir, is a set of images clear enough to survive the transmission intact. The dark lake and the low island, the ribbon that looks like nothing, the wolf studying the ribbon and understanding something, the god who moved forward when no one else did, the hand in the open mouth, the ribbon tightening not by resisting force but by receiving it, the stones driven into the ground of the island, the sword standing upright between open jaws, the river Voln running into the lake. These images are old enough and specific enough that they carry weight even now, in a telling very distant from the one that fixed them first in human memory, in the mouths of people in a cold northern place who knew the name of the sword, and the name of the lake, and the name of the island, and the name of the river that runs from the wolf's mouth, and told the story until the telling became the story. And the story became a set of images that did not require any further elaboration to do what stories do. The dark water of Amsvartnir does not reflect much in the descriptions that survive. It sits flat and dark beneath the mist, absorbing the light rather than returning it, the kind of water that makes a traveler on its surface feel the depth below more than the sky above. The island of Lyngvi, at the center of that water, holds its particular weight, not because it is large or elevated, or marked by any feature that would draw attention, but because something was done on it, and anchored to the ground beneath it, and left there. The doing was accomplished. The anchoring held. The island sat in the middle of the dark lake afterward, as it had sat before, unremarkable, low-heathered, mist-surrounded. Somewhere in the structure of the Norse cosmos, in the deep geography that the tradition mapped with the same patience it brought to every other aspect of the 9 worlds, the island of Lyngvi persists, or persisted, in the cosmological present of the myth, with the stones of Gjöll and Thvidi deep in the ground, and the cord of Gleipnir running from fetter to stone, and the wolf lying in the heather, and the sword standing between open jaws, and the river Vön running slow and pale from the wolf's open mouth into the dark water of the lake.